Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Jabesh, and for the lengthy intro.
You've done a
But
lot in
yeah,
your life, Hubert. Take a bow.
yeah. But like, thank you very much for the opportunity, and then and yeah, looking forward engaging with you, the panelists, and everyone that is listening to this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for making the time, Hubert. So next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Marinda Mekombate, who is the head of energy portfolio and investments at the African Enterprise Challenge Fund, where he specializes in renewable energy investment and project management. Before joining AECF, he had worked as a business advisor with Impact Investing Solutions in Switzerland, where he held senior positions. He's also held senior positions at LGT Venture Philanthropy, the UNDP, and Camco Clean Energy, leading renewable energy investments across West Africa. His expertise deals in sourcing and portfolio management and is complemented by a Master of Development Finance from the University of Stellenbosch Business School and a PhD in Accounting and Finance from De Montfort University. Dr. Combat, please say hello to the people.
Hi, thank you so much, Jabesh, and everyone. Happy to be here, and yeah, looking forward to engaging with fellow panelists and participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to introduce someone who actually wanted to push the leave the meeting button when the recording got pushed, just like I did. Sharon Olind. Sharon is a fintech and financial inclusion expert, and Sharon has a background of over 18 years of experience while working with various multinational banks, including Barclays, Citibank, and Standard Chartered, with her primary focus being advising on building and providing a wide suite of trade finance solutions to multinational corporate as well as SME clients. For the last decade, she has worked and consulted on several fintech companies to provide debt solutions to an array of corporate and SME clients. This has included leadership positions at Umati Capital, Lendable, and Momentum Credit, Platcorp Group, and Monster Finance. Sharon continues to work as a consultant with fintech companies such as Chirpy Kenya Limited. Sharon, welcome. Please say hello to everyone.
Hello, everybody. I hope you guys can hear me. Thank you very much to Jacob's Ladder and the team. Pleasure to meet all my panelists again, and looking forward to this session this evening. So thank you so much, Jabesh.
All right, awesome. Next up, we have Jacqueline Musitwa. She's the Deputy Assistant Administrator of USAID's Bureau for Human Assistance, and she's the U.S. government lead for international disaster response, with a mandate to save lives and alleviate human suffering and reduce the impact of disasters. BHA monitors, mitigates, and responds to global hazards and humanitarian need. The Bureau also promotes resilience by preparing communities for disasters before they strike and by helping people to recover beyond crisis. Before joining BHA, Jacqueline was a senior climate finance advisor in the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security, leading the climate finance portfolio and leading the team to mobilize $16.7 billion in 2023. And she also co-led the task team on access to finance in fragile and conflict-affected states. Ms. Musitwa has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Davidson College and a Juris Doctor from the University of Melbourne. Jacqueline, do you want to say hello, please?
Thanks, Jabesh. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I definitely look forward to sharing more about what USAID is doing and how we are thinking about climate, and in particular, climate adaptation in the hardest to reach places across Africa. Thank you.
Awesome. Welcome, Jacqueline. Next, we have Emanuela Doreen Kofi. And Emanuela is a lawyer, a passionate climate change activist, and a skilled climate negotiator. Her legal pursuits revolve around environmental integrity, international environmental law, climate negotiations, climate finance, gender, migration, climate policy, renewable energy, and intergenerational equity. She was a member of the delegation of Ghana's negotiators during COP28 in Dubai and in the 60th session of the subsidiary bodies meeting in Germany. Currently, Emanuela works in the Office of the General Counsel of the Green Climate Fund in Incheon, South Korea, where she works in areas such as funded activity agreement, legal assessment, privileges and immunities, legal research, among others. She also serves as the Director of Legal Affairs at Grand Hedge International, an NGO based in Ghana, which is focused on advocating for just energy transition and providing alternate renewable energy solutions for households in Ghana. In this role, she oversees legal and compliance aspects of the She Blue Initiative, a project under the MasterCard Foundation, which aims to enhance access to clean cooking fuels and technologies in Africa, contributing to a sustainable future. Also, she's an IOM youth delegate for COP29 to be held in Baku. Welcome, Emanuela.
Thank you very much, Jacob Slatter. Thank you so much, Jabesh, Melanie, for pulling this together. It's always a pleasure. Despite the time difference, this is very important to me, and I'm really looking forward to learning from colleague presenters, and also to learn from the audience as to what exactly these topics mean to them and what some of us as negotiators should really focus on when we go for COP to advocate for them. So thank you, and I'm excited.
Thank you, Emanuela. We're certainly privileged to have you on the call. Last, I am going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'll keep it short. So my name is Jabesh. I am a professional engineer. I've been working in the energy space for more than 15 years, primarily executing projects across all verticals of the energy space, from fuel supply to infrastructure to generation, distribution, and the whole nine. And this includes technical, financial, commercial, due diligence, and engineering roles across all these projects. Currently, I'm a partner at a firm called Arthur Energy Africa. We're a Ghana-based firm, multi-award-winning energy consultancy and advisory company that is working to serve clients across the continent with all the energy solutions that they could possibly need. So today, I am going to be looking forward to learning, probably more than anybody else here, about what is available in terms of the climate finance space as it pertains to the African continent. And so first, I think we're going to be having a couple of housekeeping rules, please, if I might. First, we're going to be having a couple of presentations from each of our speakers. Some of them are going to be actual presentations, and some of them are going to be sort of speaker-led discussions, if you will, on a variety of topics. We expect that we're going to be covering subjects around sort of an overview of Africa's climate finance landscape, then also talking about innovative financing mechanisms, as well as talking about some of the success stories of African nations with respect to climate resilience and achieving targeted financing. Then we're also going to talk about a little bit about private sector engagement, and then we're going to try to close it off with some expert thoughts about the road to COP29 and what it means for the African continent and how everyone can engage with the subject going forward. So I'd like to open with Herbert Ruzibiza. If you wouldn't mind getting on, and please share with us a little bit about how you see Africa's climate finance landscape, please.
So thank you very much once again for the opportunity, Jacob's Ladder and the great team. So I think it's important to also put a bit of a background. Excuse me. Since the Paris Agreement, I think with Africa was, being a lower contributor to the global emission, still had to also align its policies and is the plans and resource mobilization plans to actually contribute to the global agenda. So as of today, by 2030, we actually need to mobilize close to $3 trillion $3 trillion of investment, both in mitigation and adaptation. That's roughly around 277 billion every year. I mean, since 2020 up to 2030. So we had several occasions to sit down with policymakers, private sector operators, UNFCCC, and many actors within the climate space. Attended various meetings, COPs, and the most recent one, I mean, the Climate Week, of course, and always wrapping our head around how do we ensure that Africa gets to mobilize its resources. Of course, it's not an easy one, but from the lessons learned, countries that were actually successful, not necessarily mobilizing everything, but getting closer, were the ones that were putting in place policies that were not that were actually integrated from an economic development plan perspective with an environmental action, and all that spearheaded through ministries of finance. You probably heard of the coalition of ministries of finance involving climate finance. This is to say that it's no longer just an environmental issue, but it's all embedded together within the economic plan. So yes, when you talk about investments, when you talk about resource mobilization, that means we're talking about pipelines, we're talking about instruments that will allow the flow of capital. So another point to make as of today is, since the Paris Agreement, we had several meetings that were geared towards positioning Africa. There was the Global Summit, the Global Summit Pact in Paris, organized by President Macron, and which led to the Africa Climate Summit. And the Africa Climate Summit was actually one of the first of its kind on the continent, but also showing leadership by the continent in mobilizing resources, or at least planning to do so. So one of the key outcomes was a clear planning on pipelines around renewable energies, more than $100 billion of projects, and that also led to reinforcing, our Africa perspective on carbon markets. The other point that came out was also the green industrialization. And why I'm mentioning that is because beyond just the big global figures as Africa, which we need definitely to mobilize both in mitigation and adaptation, the most important is that from now we have African countries taking the lead, engaging conversations not only with with the multi-sectoral parties, from MDBs to private sector, private investment fund, to multilaterals, and everyone is converging towards the concept of blended investment, not only blended finance, but blended investment structures that will allow the attraction of those investments. So challenge, I would say, is the lack of coordination among African countries, and how does it trickle down within a particular country, having the right institutions and the right dialogue between those institutions to allow the right flow of capital. And I'm happy that we have someone from the Green Climate Fund, because people think that the Green Climate Fund is the only source of funding, but our experience shows that it's one of the source, but you have to work also with various capital providers towards that blended. And as long as you are sure of your pipeline and the impact that you want to have, the Green Climate Fund becomes a great source, not to fully capitalize, but to be a catalyzer in what you're trying to achieve. Today, we're talking about the new quantitative collective goals. And I think people who attended the last COP16 in Colombia, Cali, those were the main conversation. How do we recalibrate the new collective for quantitative goals for Africa? How do we ensure that it becomes more realistic for us to achieve those numbers and actually to create the right impacts in our economies in general? So I will just stop there before going in too much detail on how to provide solutions towards resource mobilization, because it's also embedded in the various interventions of the other panelists.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Hubert. I think you've left me with a pretty easy job to do in terms of a transition. You know, sort of requesting $2 trillion. I'm happy that's not my job to provide that kind of money. I don't know where I would start. Dr. Kombat, I'd like you to take it up from here if you don't mind, to talk to us a little bit about what you see as innovative financing mechanisms that would be available to the people of the continent to be able to bridge that gap that Hubert has been speaking about.
Right. Thank you, Jabesh. Should I share my screen or Melanie would do?
It's your presentation is just
Okay.
is up now.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Jabesh, and thank you everyone online for joining us today to discuss the pressing need for innovative financing schemes in the climate finance space, particularly within the African context. And I think Hubert has actually softened the grounds for me in terms of laying out, you know, what the landscape looks like. And I'm just, you know, summarizing, you know, what the landscape looks like in terms of common sources and mechanisms that we see in the landscape. So in terms of sources, I mean, the primary sources are public, not state on that. Yeah, public and private. And then the spectrum of instruments or mechanisms include green bonds, debt swaps, guarantees, non-concessional and concessional loans, multilateral grants, carbon finance. This list is not, you know, an exhaustive list, but just examples of instruments that you will see in the market. And I think each of these instruments plays a very important role. But having said that, we've seen an increase in call for innovation in the space. And I think Hubert again touched on some of the trends that we see. The next slide, please. And I think there are many reasons, but I decided to just focus on 3 reasons why there is that call for more innovative financial mechanisms, you know, in the climate finance space. And the first one, when Hubert was talking about the statistics, I was like, I hope I'm not quoting the wrong numbers. And rightly, 277 billion needed annually, you know, up to if we were to meet the 2030 climate goals. I think around 2019, 2020, this figure was around 30 billion, moved up to about 44 billion in 2022. So you can see the gap between what is being supplied and what is needed. And the second reason is that if we continue to rely on these, you know, traditional instruments such as grants and concessional loans, we will be limiting ourselves. You know, we'll be limiting our ability to scale up financing to the level that is required to meet climate goals by 2030. And for that reason, there is the need for us to really diversify the sources of funding. As Hubert mentioned, there are multilateral institutions like GCF, but these are not the only sources of funding that can be mobilized for climate financing. Next slide. Okay, so one of the trends, and again, Hubert touched on this, is blended finance, which we think would be a key mechanism to fund climate adaptation and mitigation in Africa, not just in Africa, but I think it is an instrument that has gained popularity across the globe. And it is an instrument that is essential for bridging the financing gap that we see in the space, which I alluded to earlier. It also provides, a mechanism to leverage limited public funds and attract funding from private sources. And, that instrument also provides an opportunity for various sources of funding, impact investment, private, whether it is equity or debt, to be mobilized alongside each other to de-risk projects and actually facilitate financing of climate mitigation and adaptation projects. Next slide. Right. In recent years, especially in energy access space, we've seen a shift towards result-based financing. And I think those who are very active in the energy access space, especially in the off-grid space, would attest to this. We have had a lot of programs, especially for mini grids, using result-based financing, and that payments are based on agreed upon results. That should be achieved before unlocking the incentives. It focuses on measurable outcomes. You'll be talking about number of home systems and reduced CO2 emissions. And this instrument also gives private sector operators the flexibility to adapt or to adjust their operating business models to be able to meet the targets that are necessary to unlock the benefit. So what this instrument does is that it encourages private sector players to optimize resources and maximize results. And we have seen that, especially in matured markets here at AECF, where we've deployed grant capital to support the deployment of off-grid solar systems. And what that has done is, it has pushed private sector players in markets that they wouldn't have otherwise ventured into. So it also enhances accountability because it is a way of using a market approach, to support private sector players with grant funding that can hold them accountable to specific outcomes. And using that kind of instrument, you are able to crowd in private sector funding, from companies, because, some of the programs that we run at AECF, we have a requirement for matching grants or matching funds. So the grants that we give them, we require matching funding from the companies. And that actually, facilitates the deployment of, renewable energy products and services in areas that are currently lacking those services. Next. Yeah, I think that's it. So to summarize, it is important for us to continue to dialogue and work together to explore innovative financing schemes, especially blended finance, as well as RBF, result-based financing, which is a buzzword in the industry, to be able to facilitate or support climate initiatives, either in the adaptation or mitigation space. Thank you.
I know whose door I'm going to be banging down the next time I need some money for a project. So please come back. Expect to see me following you to and from work. for the purposes of getting my hands on some of that. Thank you so much for sharing that information. I particularly found that incredibly useful. I think that quite often in looking at projects across the continent, sort of the requirements start to feel a little bit onerous in terms of what you can view as viable financing options to be able to get projects started. So thank you for sharing that information. I hope other people that are on this webinar got as much out of that as humanly possible. You also provided us with quite a bit of context for what we'd like to move into discussing next. And next, we'd like to hear from Jacqueline. And Jacqueline, I think some of what Combat was talking about involves sort of de-risking to facilitate climate funding and results-based funding. I also made a note about some of what he talked about with respect to diversity funding and matching grants. And I thought that made for a wonderful transition to sort of your key subject area, which is building community-level climate resilience through targeted funding. And could you please share a couple of success stories from around the continent for some of what you guys have been able to do in terms of helping some of these communities that are probably more affected by climate than some others?
Thank you so much. And once again, thank you to Jacob's Ladder and everyone else that has been part of the organizing team. Perhaps before I answer your question, let me take a step back to just put into context where USAID is with respect to climate finance. In 2022, we released a multi-year strategy, so that's 2022 to 2030, that was focused on several things, including a mobilization target of 150 billion. And that would be sourced from both public and private finance. As we know, there is not enough public money to reach that goal. So for us, it was really important to be creative in how we would work collaboratively with the private sector, philanthropy, and others, not only to help us get to our goal, but also to help get to that $1 trillion missing part of finance. We do so in several ways. One pillar of our work is really focused on climate diplomacy. How can USAID support the rest of the US government to engage in conversations about climate, but also in particular climate finance? We engage with our colleagues at the US Treasury as they have conversations about multilateral development bank reform with the World Bank and IMF. We also engage with the vertical climate funds, such as the Green Climate Fund, where recently, this is about August of this year, we signed an MOU with the GCF to really focus on that aspect of localization and bringing down to the most local of communities within the countries that USAID works in, but also that the GCF is targeting to make sure that we could bring to bear our localized expertise and really connect our grant capital with the capital that the GCF brings to bear. In addition to grant capital, we also provide technical assistance and really helping projects that are being shaped in countries that are not always seen as the most bankable to come up with projects that the GCF would be interested in. I'm really, really excited that at the last GCF board meeting, which just happened to be last week, we managed to support 3 of the projects that went through board approval. One that happened to be in Malawi, another one that happened to be in Somalia. So that also just gives you an indication that it is possible to bring that localized perspective of funding and match that with kind of the multilateral development banks, as well as vertical climate funds. But it takes time, is kind of the caveat. In addition to climate diplomacy, another area that I think is important to highlight is kind of our support to USAID missions. We have USAID missions in about 80 countries around the world and a majority of African countries. We end up working with our local teams to provide grants and technical assistance, really with the goal of improving private sector development through increasing local resource mobilization. We also support governments with public finance management. So something that Hubert mentioned before was around, regulatory regimes. And that's an area that we think is important for sustained interest, growth within climate finance. So, for instance, one of the projects that I was recently working on was in Kenya, and really supporting the Kenyan government over the past year or so with the climate change law, but also which really focused on how they want to look forward on carbon finance. So the law passed, and something we're working now is focused on the regulations, which we think is one of the main areas that Kenya could definitely exploit its carbon finance potential. Another area that we think is quite important, especially within the technical space for us to get right, is how African countries are able to draft but also follow through with their nationally determined contributions and their national adaptation plans. So through a USAID mechanism called CASI, we end up working very closely with local governments to support them to draft those, to make sure that there is a plan moving forward. They are able to mobilize bilateral support such as ours, but equally they are able to frame those documents as a way to better engage the private sector so they can mobilize outside the, so to say, traditional structures. The last way, which I think is quite important, and just going back to Combate's presentation, which I think was quite excellent, is that of innovative finance. And we've been thinking through a number of mechanisms and where our dollars would best be spent. But just to highlight a few, which I think are important, is one around, first I'll start with guarantees and kind of get it out of the way. When the US International Development Finance Corporation was created several years ago, USAID's authority over guarantees shifted to the DFC. So we no longer provide guarantees. Having said that, where there is an opportunity for guarantees, we liaise very closely with the DFC, and on our end up providing either grants or technical assistance in whatever blended finance structure might be the most appropriate. Another example, besides working within US government, is also our collaboration with Nordic countries. We work very closely under a structure called the Investment Mobilization Collaboration Alliance with the governments of Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden to think through how to undo some of these challenges across emerging markets. One that I would like to highlight, because there is a notification for funding that is out right now, is focused on greening value chains in Africa. So please stay tuned, because that particular financing mechanism will bring to bear grants, technical assistance, and guarantees for fund managers that are operating on the continent that are thinking about as well as investing in broadly greening value chains. So that could vary from renewable energy all the way to e-mobility and the like. So it would be great if we could get more people interested as well as signed up for that. And you can find information on the website of the Climate Finance for Development Accelerator. So hopefully the organizers can send out information after this. In addition to that, we've been very bullish on carbon finance. I mentioned the instance of Kenya, but we've also supported the work that the State Department has done about really creating a carbon finance framework for how the US government engages across the world. And we've provided support across multiple countries. We have active projects right now in Mozambique, Liberia, and Ghana as well. And we're looking to do more across the continent. We've also taken a very strong play, can I say, in green banks. We supported the Blue Green Bank of Barbados, but we're also looking to do more across the continent and have been in active conversations with the African Development Bank and others of really trying to make sure we create appropriate structures for different countries. So we come from the school of thought that it's not necessary to create an institution per se, but we also believe in layering the appropriate products in the different countries that are interested in green banks as a product. As far as bonds, we created the Green Guarantee Company, and through that, we are able to provide guarantees, including to green bonds. We're working closely with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where we are also providing support to Zambia and Mozambique on bonds. All that to say is, I think we are doing a lot across the continent, and I think it's important as a bilateral donor to continue to do more and really to provide our capital to de-risk and also to play a role in experimentation and piloting some of these new structures in order to bring in private capital, but also to demonstrate the fact that it is possible. And so I think as you think of USAID, look at us as a partner for one that can really support the testing and coming up with scalable solutions where sometimes it is hard to find such. The last example I'll give is around adaptation. A lot of time we focus on mitigation, and I think that there is the business case there. I think where we're all challenged, to be honest, is around adaptation. And so we did have an adaptation financing window under the Climate Finance for Development Accelerator, really to tease out some of the solutions around bankability of adaptation. And based on the proposals that we've selected a few, which will be announced at COP29, so stay tuned. But all of the proposals that have been selected really demonstrate how adaptation is viable and as a bankable solution, but also demonstrate the fact that it can be scaled across multiple geographies, including geographies where my current role under the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance is most invested. We operate in the hardest to reach countries. These are countries that are affected by different levels of fragility. That is everything from political fragility to conflict, but also countries that are really dealing with the worst of climatic conditions. And in such situations, at the highest of level, we provide funding to the UN's Climate Emergency Response Fund, but also at a localized level, work through smaller blended finance structures, really to find ways not only to mobilize capital, but also find ways to garner interest locally to increase the capacity of emergency response initiatives and mechanisms within the countries that we operate. And so, for instance, right now, I'm on this call from Zimbabwe. So Hwange, Zimbabwe, are really looking at the effects of El Nino and the drought here, and really working closely on resilience and food security projects that we've invested in, trying to find ways to help localized communities here, not only withstand, El Nino, but as we prepare for La Nina, really thinking through what solutions might be relevant, be it parametric insurance, be it climate smart agriculture, and really working collectively at the local level, working with farmers, local government to think through as to how to build that local resilience and eventually build kind of the national resilience around climate. I'll go ahead and stop there and give more inputs later. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Jacqueline. Jacqueline, if you don't mind, I've seen one question in the chat from Charlotte. Charlotte, if you don't mind, please turn on your microphone. I'd like you to be able to ask your question, please, and then we'll continue with Sharon's submission, please. Hello, Charlotte.
Hello, how are you?
Doing well, Charlotte. Please go ahead with your question for Jacqueline, please. I thought that your question would be appropriate with Jacqueline regarding the donor-donee relationships and elements around that. Please go ahead with that, please.
So yeah, I was just saying that like a slight discrepancy that has donated the donor-donee relations is that a lot of the funding is based or is reliant a lot on quantitative progress that undermines qualitative impacts of these programs. And how could the innovative financing models mitigate this?
Oh, sorry,
I'm only
Jacqueline.
speaking. Okay. I think I'm on now. Thank you so much, Charlotte. I'm only speaking from one donor perspective. So I think what's hard in this space is that there are several of us with different views on how to approach this. From a USAID perspective, I think what's important to highlight is we have an overall agency localization target. And for us, that's really important to start to shift the dialogue, not to being one of Washington, D.C. to the partners we work with, but really being collaborative, co-designing, and working closely with our partners in the different countries that we operate in to really make sure that we are addressing their particular needs. So for instance, we have a goal that by 2025, which is only a couple of months away, 25% of our funding will be determined by local entities where we operate. So if you think about that, like the budget of let's just say, one bureau in USAID could be well over 10 billion. So if you think about 25% of that really being determined locally, I think is a huge progress and step from where we've come from. By 2030, the idea is that 50% of not only budgeting, but also decision-making and effectively agency will be in the hands of the people that we work with. And so really trying to become more equal within decision-making action, but equally accountability. From a humanitarian perspective, we do have principles of locally led humanitarian principles of really trying to then go from the USAID strategy to a BHA, Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance strategy, really focused on making sure that in contexts where there are high levels of mistrust already, where there is fragility and a lot of time mobility, that we are guided by principles that help us to ground us. Now, back to your question, I think we do fairly well on the quantitative. We are able, for instance, to say we have moved X amount of cargo into a particular area. On the qualitative, I think that's one area where we would definitely welcome ideas and help. How can we better tell the story and how can we better narrate what is happening? For instance, like a village I went to today here in Hwange, Zimbabwe, 2 lawmakers on Capitol Hill, for them to really understand the impact of what is happening as a result of no rain. And what happens if there is no collaboration, not only with USAID, but other partners. And I think that there is a wonderful opportunity for all of us to really think through how to improve the narrative, one, how to make sure that there are strong voices from the communities we work in, two, but also how to make sure that there is ongoing dialogue with multiple stakeholders around the world. And it's really hard, and big conferences like COP are one opportunity, but I think that I definitely welcome. And so please feel free to reach out to me with ways that we can improve that narrative to make sure that it is not one-sided. Because the result of it being one-sided is, I think, what we've seen before is you do get a certain lens. And I think stepping into the world of literature and someone that I admire deeply, Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi, we need to move away from that single story and narrative. And I think that this is a wonderful opportunity, whether it is through social media, whether it is through direct engagement, to make sure that that African narrative and story and the realities and the pictures of what people are experiencing and the effects are really felt across the world. And right now, it's arguable that that isn't necessarily going through. So Charlotte, thank you for that. And I definitely welcome ongoing dialogue on how we can improve.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Charlotte, for asking the question. Jacqueline, I do see a couple of requests for information with respect to links in terms of the partnerships that USAID and BHA are having with the Green Climate Fund. So if you don't mind, I just want to make a note of that so that at some point, Simon, thank you for putting that in the chat. But I think you make some amazing points about what it means from a program level in terms of what the individual needs of communities are and how that gets measured. So thank you for sharing that information with us. Next up, we're going to get to somebody who is going to talk primarily about private sector engagement, with a particular perspective on fintech and financial inclusion and related items. Sharon, could you please talk to us a little bit about how private sector engagement can help to fulfill sort of the change or the flow from pledges to actual action, please?
Yes. I hope everyone again can hear me. Thank you so much, Jabesh and Jacob's Ladder. Melanie, can you share the presentation on the?
Sure, shortly.
So yeah, just as we wait for that to come up, let me preface this by saying, obviously, I've been asked to talk about private sector engagement, and I do come at the issue of climate finance from a very from that space, from the private sector space, both from traditional financial institutions as well as from the private sector itself. So I will definitely, I'm speaking on it with that hat. But just to, before, we can move on to the next slide, but before we get into the slide, just to tie what my fellow panelist Kombati had said, I think, number one, I think it's important that particularly on the finance space, we need to get the private financial players, the traditional financial institutions, whether it's VC, whether it's debt funding, we need to get them excited about climate finance. I think that's really, really key to their involvement. And as Kombati had said earlier, and he spoke on very eloquently on blended finance, I think besides all the other mechanisms that he listed earlier, including things like green bonds and guarantees, I think one of the key ways to get the private sector involved, particularly from a financing point of view, is going to be looking at blended finance. But we have to get them excited about it. I think you hear about it in pockets in the private sector, but I think it's key that their involvement is going to be key to make climate financing sustainable over long periods of time. And I think it's key for them, and that's what I'll be, mentioning briefly here, is, are there opportunities for them to be had in this space? And from my perspective, yes, I've worked in traditional financial institutions, I've worked in non-traditional financing institutions, and I've worked a lot with SME players, both in agriculture, manufacturing, technology, services. And I think in all those realms, there is a space, there is a way for them to be involved in a meaningful way. But again, the excitement has to be there. So in terms of opportunities, I think there's several that I'm just going to highlight a couple of them here. One of the big ones that we need to recognize is agricultural and supporting sustainable agricultural practices and ensuring that financing, we set parameters by which, if they want to access this blended financing, which is very attractive to them, what parameters need to be set those out, and to work with the right partners in order for monitoring and evaluation to be done. I did a project a couple of years ago working just in this space, doing some climate financing here in central Kenya. And it was key for us and for the financier to appreciate and to be involved with strategic partnerships in order to be able to meet and carry out the proper evaluation and support in the agri-financing they're providing. So I think one of the big things there is in the private sector, we have to continue to push and to recognize the strength of the partnerships that are needed in order for parameters by which financing can be delivered can be met. I think there's huge opportunities in the investment space in waste management. I've mentioned a couple of here, like bio-waste and the conversion of waste materials, and working for industrial use, and working with companies that are doing that, as well as on the renewable energy side. I myself have done a lot of financing the renewable energy space, particularly in the solar space. But I think the opportunity has been so far limited. It has they've been focused on rural communities, or on a very small scale on the retail side, I think that can be expanded widely. And I think there's a huge opportunity there to expand the way we look at things like solar home systems, not only in rural communities, but also in urban settings, as well as expanding usage in industrial use and the financing of that space. I think there's an opportunity there that has not been fully exploited. And I think if that was at the forefront, that would really help in seizing and showing that opportunity for investment is there. Jacqueline, just before I spoke, talked about getting green financing into value chains. I was so excited to hear her say that because I've worked also not only on the SME segment side of things or the retail side of things. I've done a lot of work on the corporate side, but large corporates have huge value chains and huge supply chains that they're managing. And it's important that because of the strength and the influence that the corporate has in their value chains, for them to be supportive of bringing things like green financing to those value chains. In things like supply chain finance programs or distributor finance programs, or other methods of working capital based financing. I think large corporates have a very big role to play, and their support is crucial, particularly when looking for investment from the financing space. We look at these corporates as a partner and the influence they have on their value chains, to be able to press upon them the need for certain practices to be met in order for them to be able to support them in accessing green financing is super important. So Jacqueline was so excited when you mentioned that, because it is a very good way and a very good opportunity for corporates to be involved in investment opportunities downstream or upstream in their value chains. So those are just to mention, again, how these are some of the areas where we can get private investment excited and we can get the private players excited. We need them to be part and parcel of the dialogue, because particularly on the continent here, where the SME space is the huge growth, sector in terms of business, manufacturing, agri, renewable energy. Their support and their ability to draw that investment is going to be key for sustainable growth and sustainable financing to reach them. Now, obviously, the flip side of that is there are barriers, and I think we recognize in the private sector that there are barriers to these opportunities. So Melanie, if you move to the second slide, the next slide here. What are the barriers thank you. What are some of the barriers to this investment and realizing some of this investment? I think one, obviously, and I think definitely some of my other panelists have mentioned this, and I think this is a discussion that is a continuous discussion to be had and will continue to be had, particularly as we are trying to achieve those 2030 climate goals, is the regulatory environment. There is no unified framework for financial institution or intermediaries to follow. And I think definitely sometimes you have to put, stab someone with a knife or prod them a bit, or as we say in America, hold a gun to someone's head and push them to get some of these things done. And that, comes from a regulatory regime where that's very succinct in terms of how it approaches climate finance. So it's likely that we're going to need a lot more government involvement. I've seen, I've worked for some Western focused funds, and they can be very clear that, if it doesn't meet these certain parameters, funding just will not be released. So I think particularly on the continent, just because of all the stages of development that the continent is in terms of the different jurisdictions that we deal with, we're going to need a heavily more very succinct government involvement in terms of these strategies. I think we need to, as I said in the beginning, to reach the private sector and to reach both the private sector and private sector finance, we have to show them that there is a pathway to linking climate finance to profitability. Because obviously in the private sector, it's all about the commercials. And it should not ever appear that if we're climate finance forward, it means a lack of profitability. And I think it's very key that that hurdle is overcome to show that they're not, they're two of the same coin, that there's still profitability. Even in a blended finance scenario, profitability is there if we link the parameters of climate finance together. So I think that's a hurdle that still needs to be overcome. And lastly, I think measurement is also one of the key barriers or hurdles that we need to overcome. I think a lot of times when we think of how is the impact of the financing sort of shown, we've seen a lot of project focused results. I think it has to be a broader conversation in terms of, how is this measured? What's a continuous measurement? It's not a once-off measurement, but on a continuous scale. What does measurement look like? What does success look like? What does growth success look like? And sustained growth as well as accelerated growth in this space look like? I think we have to have some more standardized or long-term and less project-focused measurement in order for some of the private sector players to anchor themselves in this type of financing structure. So those are just some of my thoughts, and I think, as I said, we're getting there slowly. I think we just have to continue getting private sector players excited about and really entrenched in what climate finance brings in terms of sustainability and growth, and what it can bring in terms of funding if we can get that right, mix right. So I'll stop there. Thank you again, and definitely, I'm here to talk more and take questions.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Sharon, I'd like to ask you a quick question, something that came up in the chat. Zach from Kenya was asking, how do we transform Africa from being a climate finance market rather than contributors, kind of within the context of going from green consumers to green producers? You got any thoughts on that?
I think it's hard for me. I mean, I think there's no one, good response to that question. I think, yeah, Zach, I totally agree with you. And I think as we see more funding that is coming out of the continent, not necessarily coming into the continent, which is like, we tend to see financing coming in, but as we also disseminate financing, throughout the continent, I think that's where we're going to see that come into play. That we need, the local funds, the local players, the local institutions. Often some of them can be dictated from abroad in terms of how to, extend financing and things like that. But I think it's going to come when we have more of the localized funding going out and agreeing with or seeing the benefits of having this type of financing linked to the sustainable growth sectors that they're financing in. I think that is a possibility. And I think one thing that I've seen, and I've been working on the continent for almost 20 years, and what's beautiful about what I've seen about financing lately is how much more of private sector financing is localized. It's coming from within the continent. And I think we're going to see that grow. And I think we're going to see that grow within this lens.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. Greatly appreciate it. Zach, if I might, I'm going to share a little bit of my own experience working on projects and, getting to financial close on things. I think quite frequently when we look at a lot of businesses, we're within the African continent, and I understand that there is a frustration, an underlying frustration, if you will, regarding the speed or the progress of things. But to some degree, there are spheres of professionalism where we all need to learn to play the game. And I think to some degree, quite frequently, a lot of people don't do a good enough job of tying the financing into basically results, if you will, that allow people to see a commercial proposition that looks like risk mitigation, but also looks like profitability, right? It becomes significantly easier for folks to believe in a project that is being financed to offset something where the opportunity cost is significant enough to cover the cost of that financing. And so to some degree, we have to do a better job, I mean, as people who promote projects, of creating the situation where the money that is being spent is basically being made more efficient. That way, there's already liquidity to back a lot of what the financing is supposed to be going to support. I have a lot more views about some of those things, but I will save them because our next speaker, Emanuela, to me, I mean, during one of our last sessions, she came across very, very strongly in terms of somebody who is extremely knowledgeable about the negotiating side of the equation and with respect to climate finance. And I'm looking forward to hearing what Emanuela has to say about kind of the road to COP29 and what that means in terms of the African finance story with respect to climate. So Emanuela, if you could please share with us your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Jabez. Melanie, could you please share my slide? Thank you.
Emanuela, you're muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Okay,
Yes.
great. So I was just expressing a big thank you to Jabez and to Melanie for this, and also to the wonderful panelists co-panelists that we've had here, because I've been listening a lot and I'm like, okay, this is really interesting. I mean, because most of the time it's we don't have these kind of conversations where you have like policymakers, climate negotiators, have that kind of discourse with the private sector. And so it's pretty much interesting for me also because I follow carbon markets and climate finance at the COP. So it's interesting to hear the private sector, perspective. Maybe if you want to move to the next slide. But basically, this is just the outline. I think most of what I'm going to discuss have already been mentioned. But basically, it's for you to just have a broad overview of COP and what we discuss at COP. I know most people have heard this is a climate finance COP, but that is not the only thing that happens at COP. A lot of things take place there, and it is important for us to know the various thematic areas and also to have a global perspective on climate finance, what the core issues are, and especially what we also discussed during the COP, and basically what Africa's focus is going to COP29 based on the African Group of Negotiators meeting that took place in August this year, and also like my personal recommendations based on previous negotiations that I've attended. Next slide, please. Maybe next slide. I think I can. Okay, so basically this is just a list, a few of them actually, of the thematic areas for COP. So for every COP, there is an agenda set, but over the years, these have been the thematic areas. It's not just these, I think a lot more of them. I just put a few of these. So we talk about action for climate empowerment. We call it the 8, and there's a whole negotiating item on that. There is adaptation and resilience. So that is where you find the global goal on adaptation and then other negotiating items. There's also capacity building, where there are a lot of like workshops and other activities taking place under this thematic area. And then there is the climate finance, which is not just the NCQG we are going to talk about, but there is the Standing Committee on Climate Finance on Finance, which also has negotiation items. Then there is climate technology, so CTCN is also another topic that we discuss or negotiate on at the COP. There is gender, so any issues related to gender. It's also like a whole negotiating item at COP. Then there is just transition. So over here you have the Just Transition work program, among others, being discussed. Then there is issues of land use. Then there is market and non-market approaches. This is where you have Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which I follow mainly at the COP. And then basically I just repeated it, but there are a lot more of them. So it's not just about climate finance at COP. And I think all of these thematic areas have a way of tying into each other, because we're going to talk about NCQG, but there are so many climate finance discussions in each of these rooms. There is, I'll touch upon it, but the Global Goal on Adaptation, there's a climate finance issue that has been a problem over the past few COPs, and they're trying to settle it at COP29. We've also seen, finance being discussed in loss and damage as to whether there should be a specific quantum on that side, because the definition of climate action mainly revolves around mitigation and adaptation, and we had loss and damage. And so can climate finance be used to fund loss and damage? So those are like the financial questions. Even carbon market is also like a source of climate finance. So when we're going for COP, most people say NCQG, climate finance COP, but I have a very strong feeling that climate finance is going to pop up in each of these negotiation rooms. I know you probably know this already. The next slide, please. So I know you probably already know these, but I always, in any presentation that I give, I try to remind my audience and also participants as to what exactly is climate finance, because there's a whole serious controversy about what exactly climate finance is, and people have there is that kind of confusion between developmental finance and climate finance. So basically, climate finance is any local, national, or transnational financing that is drawn from all of these like public, private, and even some of these like innovative sources of finance that I think has been discussed by my previous co-panelists. And the main aim of this finance must be to support mitigation and adaptation action. So if it is not supporting mitigation or any adaptation action, it is not climate finance, no matter how similar it may look to climate finance. And the overall goal is to address climate change. And that is why I'm specifically explaining this, because when it comes to funding from the GCF and all of these multilateral funds, there is that key aspect of climate rationale. And so you should be able to really tease out what exactly is the climate perspective with the project that you're bringing. Yes, we know there has been erratic rainfall. We know it's affecting agriculture, but really you need to build that kind of nexus between the problem that exists and then it's actually climate change. So that is really taking time to talk about what exactly climate finance is. It's also important for the upcoming COP because it's going to affect the discussions around the NCQG, because so many people are talking about some items that are really not climate finance if you look at it, but because of also the impact of climate change, these discussions are sensitive, and that is why developing countries are calling for clarity as to what exactly is climate finance, who is supposed to contribute, what are the means of sort of the monitoring and evaluation of these kind of what we call climate finance, because it's going to really determine how we also, in terms of research, in terms of data collection, in terms of actually monitoring these climate finance, because we've seen some countries categorizing developmental finance as climate finance, which is dangerous for us to actually talk about meeting the collective quantified goal that we've set, because if it's not climate finance, then it shouldn't be part of the data for what we exactly call climate finance. So maybe you make the next slide, please. So the picture on the left-hand side is one interesting artwork I put together in another training I attended. We're asked to talk about climate justice and climate finance in terms of building a mind map. My artistic self is not really like that high, but I always use this picture to try to connect the nexus between climate justice and climate finance, and why Africa as a continent is really pushing for access to climate finance, because this is not just something we woke up one day to demand. You know, some continents or some countries have said, oh, why isn't Africa mobilizing climate finance? Why are we always like crying for climate finance, you know? But these are very sensitive issues, and we always, I know people are tired of hearing historical pollution, but really that is the source of all of these discussions that we are having. The fact that some countries, due to historical pollution, were able to actually develop their economies. And now when it got to our turn to develop our economies, we realized that, okay, the impact of these historical pollution, it's actually climate change, and it's impacting our economies, it's impacting our livelihoods, and there must be concerted efforts to be able to deal with these issues. But really, as a continent that is already facing serious developmental challenges, how do we build our resilience, and how do we also even build that kind of infrastructure to be able to reduce our emissions? Because I know most African, we keep saying that, oh, we emit very less CO2, but I've listened to some researchers project that if we go the business as usual, there would be a time where Africa, the continent itself, will become the major polluters if nothing is done about it. And so there is that need to balance the mitigation effort vis-a-vis the adaptation effort. But really, we can't do this without climate finance. Climate finance is really at the fulcrum of all of these efforts for us to build resilient economies to be able to adapt to climate change. And so basically, global perspective, I know you've already heard this before, but we've heard about the 100 billion annual commitment by developed countries, sorry. And these kind of discussions were just, for me, I say it was like a political, quota or content. It wasn't informed by any kind of like research and data. It was just a political quantum. And that is why we are really going for COP29 to set a new quantum. But COP29 is not the beginning of the discussion. The discussion about setting a new collective quantified goal began like 4 or 5 years before then. That was post-2020, where countries decided that by 2025, we should have really come up with a new quantum to be able to meet the climate finance that is needed to support our nationally determined contributions. And so that is the main goal of this COP29. And last year was a global stocktake COP, because we had gotten to that stage where we needed to really look into the past to see what exactly globally we've been doing to solve climate change impact, and also to be able to really assess how far we've come and what exactly we need to do, and also even at the pace with which developing countries and developed countries, have to contribute to climate action. And discussing this, we've seen, I know that Jacqueline and then Sharon and Hubert and my previous panelists have mentioned this already, but it's really kind of be overemphasized that the role or the essence of international organizations, especially the multilateral funds and the whole UNFCCC framework in mobilizing climate finance, because we've we know that there is the need for private sector mobilization or investment. We know that we are looking for alternatives, alternate sources of climate finance, but really the kind of motivation that private sector needs, the kind of motivation that other sectors need when it comes to mobilizing climate finance comes from the international organizations and the multilateral funds, because they are the designated funds for really dealing with environmental issues. And over the years, we've seen, the Green Climate Fund currently, has like about 12 billion in terms of pledges, and we're still mobilizing for more. But this is not enough compared to the kind of pipeline. If I tell you the kind of pipeline we have, it is way beyond the 12 billion. And so it goes to show you that we have very limited resources in terms of how much developed countries are contributing. And that is why I like the previous presentations on really the alternate sources of climate finance, because it's not just GCF or GEF or Adaptation Fund that can provide climate finance, but carbon market is one of the approaches, climate debt swap. Those are all innovative solutions that we must really take a keen interest in. But for me, the starting point is on the multilateral funds, which really need to do a very great job. I know I work with the GCF, but I keep saying that we need to do a great job, especially as Africa, to mobilize for more climate finance. And the more climate finance we really get into these multilateral funds will determine the number of projects that can be supported by these funds. Because also, despite the fact that there are other sources, private sector, we've seen multilateral funds like the GCF really, before even going to project financing, have like these kind of unique programs like the readiness programs and the project preparation facility to actually equip some countries with the skills, with the capacity, with the kind of knowledge to be able to even prepare project proposals or to even assess these kind of funds. And that is very crucial and important for Africa, because we've seen so many African countries do not have that kind of capacity, the infrastructure, the roadmap, even like the kind of pipeline that will enable them to have access to these kind of multilateral funds. So it's really important that the multilateral funds play a very key role. It's important that they really, really, really focus on their mandate, and they also ensure that there is enough money, there's enough capacity building on the continent to be able to allow the African countries to have access to climate finance. And I would just quickly pass over this because it has been well explained already as to also the importance of the private sector in terms of contributing to climate finance, because really we've seen I've seen statistics from Carbon Initiative, and we see the data, especially in African continent, the contribution of the private sector to climate finance is averagely around like less than 10%, I think. And then we've seen the developed countries, majority of their climate finance comes from the private sector. And so you see that kind of disproportionate balance between developed and developing countries in terms of the kind of sector that contributes to climate finance. It's also important for private sector to get involved, because along the way, it's going to be a business, right? We've seen lots of electric vehicles being produced. At the end of the day, it's contributing to climate mitigation, but it also has its business aspect, as has been discussed. And we as the African continent, we really do not have to wait to be left behind, because more often than not, we are looking for other countries or continents to start the conversations, to come up with the innovations, and then we kind of ride on these. And at the end of the day, we become consumers because we did not jump into the conversation at the time that it started. So maybe the next slide.
Emanuela, before you hit the next slide, can I ask a question real quick?
Okay.
Dr. Sabiti was asking in the chat about climate finance that's been mobilized for African climate action. and you were making some points about how sort of the Global Climate Fund and $12 billion is probably not enough against the pipeline of projects that are being submitted. And he was asking basically that effectively his belief is that it falls far short of what is needed to support implementation, particularly for NDCs. And is there any hope that the innovative financing windows available can bridge that gap? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I think it's one of the alternatives. I've mentioned that there are so many sources of climate finance, and really we need to tap into all of these sources. Even the Green Climate Fund, despite being a multilateral fund, is currently having conversations about, innovative finance. So in the last board meeting, there were about 2 or 3 projects that were approved by the board, which are REDD+ projects. I know there's been research and reports on DFCS, so like debt for climate swap. So which means that because the GCF is still analyzing the role it can play in, debt for climate swap. So although that might not be like a clear-cut mandate of the GCF, but even the GCF is looking at, innovative financing schemes for climate finance. So really, I think it plays a key role. And we as African continent, we already have developmental issues. Our economy is dwindling because of the impact of climate change. And so we really should be able to develop interest in tapping into any source that we can get climate finance. That is my approach. And so I know people have different opinions about, we venturing into carbon market and how that it, gives other continents really that kind of leverage over the continent. But I think it's a source of climate finance. And with our current state, we really should be open to tapping into all of these sources and not get left behind. I think that is what I'll say.
Okay, I think that's a phenomenal answer. I noticed that you have one slide, so Emanuela, can I let you go through the slide very quickly, and then I had a question that I wanted to throw to Combat and Herbert, and all right, let's do that.
Yeah, that's there. So just wrapping up quickly, I think I've mentioned some of these, but so following the AGN and even like previous COPs, these are the key focal areas for COP. When it comes to climate finance, we're looking at the NCQG in terms of the quantum that Africa is proposing. We really, based on the NDCs that have been submitted, we need more than $1 trillion, I think about 2.8 trillion in terms of climate finance to meet our NDCs. And so that is really the kind of focus that Africa is taking to the COP. We also need transparency. We need that kind of clear roadmap for burden sharing, who is contributing what, and how do we measure, the impact of these climate finance, and also to be able to really get these countries to actually contribute and not just make promises. And the adaptation of, I think I've mentioned this already, the GGA, we're also thinking about its operationalization at this COP. We're also thinking about inclusion of a financial aspect to the GGA. Most people are saying it should be left to the NCQG aspect, but I think the African negotiators are really looking at having that finance conversation in the GGA, as well as means of implementation. We also have discussions about loss and damage. Although the fund has been like operationalized, we still need like modalities and to be able to assess these funds, and these rules must be set by the negotiators. And on Article 6, we're still negotiating. We need to operationalize all of the mechanism, the Article 6.4, which can help countries who don't have their own registries to, to be able to tap into the carbon market aspect. And so to the final slide, just really summarizing it all, we have a very clear vision for COP. We as a continent, really, we are advocating for more financial commitment from developed countries, and with clear roadmap as to how these finance would be distributed. We're also looking out for transparency and accountability, and also a clear definition between official developmental assistance and climate finance, so that we don't have that issue of wrong reporting of what is not climate finance. And also, really, I think personally, as a recommendation, we need to leverage on the regional cooperation that we have in terms of the AFCFTA, the African Union's Agenda 2063, so that we can use that kind of regional cooperation to push our agenda. And I think that is what the EU and other continents are doing. Also, we've seen some countries, I think less than 10 countries in Africa are the countries which have access to most of the climate finance that's come to the continent, Egypt being number one among other countries. And so we need that kind of support, mutual support and knowledge sharing, so that other countries can also learn how to, have access to all of these climate finance. And also there's the key issue of really integrating our overall climate ambitions with our developmental goals, so that whilst we are thinking about climate action, we also develop the continent. So I think really these are the major roadmaps for COP29, and we really hope for an effective negotiation period at the COP. So thank you very much, Jabesh, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Emanuela. We appreciate you staying with us at an ungodly hour. That feels a little bit like boarding school time. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to throw around broadly, so every one of our experts has a chance to kind of shoot off about it. First, we had a question particularly about the proposed target for the AGN of 1.3 trillion until 2030. Does anyone have anything in particular that they wanted to say about that? Combat, Herbert,
maybe I can give it a try.
Yeah, please go right ahead.
I think the question is about the 1.3 trillion of for the Africa Green Industrialization plans, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So, in actual sense, those are targets based on the necessary investment needed in key industrial sector, infrastructural sector, for Africa to leapfrog its development. But again, those are big tickets. When you look at one single project, let's say a railroad that will connect Tanzania through Rwanda, passing by Uganda, and then you want to make it climate resilient. It's a multiple country project. There's a need of a certain approach. How does it really qualify as a sustainable investment project? But more importantly, the procurement. How is the procurement law within each countries? And how do you ensure that you don't have one country faster than the other? And that's an example of multiple country approach, because most of those industrialization plans are not necessarily in one country, but some actually cross-cutting many countries. The Congo Basin comprises of Gabon, Congo, DRC, and a lot has to be done in partnership. Right. Same at the Great Green Wall, crossing from Djibouti to Chad up to Mauritania, Senegal. So right. All of that on paper, yes, it makes sense, but the mechanism to mobilize the resources are quite hectic.
Okay, thank you very much.
But they are needed.
Understood. Thank you very much, Herbert. We had a different question also that relates to financing. I think Sharon or Combat might want to take this one on. What would be your advice for local fund managers that are looking to move into adaptation finance, especially in frontier markets?
I think they first, I'll talk about this a little bit. I think number one, they need to know what parameters to set, what they want to meet in terms of that type of financing. And if they don't have, often they will lack. I've seen in the past, they don't have the proper skill set in-house to be able to assess whether or not it's the financing that they want to extend is going to actually meet the parameters to be set around that type of financing. So I think it's important to make sure you have a good partner for assessment. I think that's one of the biggest hurdles to face, and make sure your partner is relevant in the value chain that you are planning on working in. So, someone who's working in agriculture, and the parameters that have to be met or to meet in that value chain is going to be very different than someone, let's say, in manufacturing, where sort of maybe emissions is a goal that has to be met vis-a-vis sustainable farming practices and on the other side. So I think one is be very, very clear on which value chain or where that financing is targeting, and find a very good partner that can help you with the assessment angle of it.
Yeah, if I may add, to
please
what
go right ahead.
Yeah, I think it is important to have an ecosystem building approach. I think even for development finance institutions like Africa Enterprise Challenge Fund, we've actually found that using an ecosystem building approach or partnership approach is really important to unearth companies or SMEs with growth potential, support them to scale up. So if you adopt that approach, you have institutions like us who, take on so much risk. We have big appetite for risk, and then we build capacity for SMEs in addition to giving them financial resources. So they get to a point where they have capacity to absorb commercial funding. But those SMEs and, there is always, a challenge to bring the supply side and demand side together. So I think adopting an ecosystem building approach would actually help you to, to be able to build a pipeline of investment-ready companies that have been de-risked by development finance institutions like AECF, for you to take them to the next stage, or to the next level. So I think that is one important thing that any fund manager moving into climate adaptation or mitigation should take into account, in addition to what Sharon has also mentioned. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Combat. I think that was a particularly useful add-on there. I do have a question from Lorraine that I'd like to pass to everyone on the panel, which is also related to financing. And she was asking that with all the pressure to go green and the need to decarbonize, net zero targets by 2030 and the need for organizations to get climate financing, how can financiers curb a scenario of greenwashing? Now, I've never heard the term greenwashing, so I'm looking forward to hearing somebody explain it to me and then try to take on this question, if you don't mind. Somebody put your hand up, or I'm going to take.
I think, this is just, when Emanuela was doing her presentation, I think she talked about what is actually climate finance and what is not. Right. I think it is important to delineate what actually is green financing and what actually is presented as green financing, but in actual sense is not. So I think that is where there are issues around greenwashing. I think really purporting to do what what is actually not green financing. And I don't know if that clarifies in terms of what greenwashing is, but it's just an issue that many people are beginning to be worried about, because when you are looking at statistics, you really want to be clear as to what the funding flow is for green financing, instead of having things that do not really represent that being counted as part of it.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that explanation. That actually makes it remarkably simple. I think we're a couple of minutes over our planned time. So just a couple of housekeeping things real quick. I wanted to thank everyone who participated on the panel. I wanted to thank everyone who participated and logged in at various points. Thank you for everyone that was active in the chat. Thank you for everyone who's been sharing information. I've seen some stuff about some documentaries and some write-ups and articles. I'll be looking forward to trying to see them all. If anyone has any information that they want to share, whether you were on the panel or you were a participant, please get in touch with the Jacobs Ladder team via all their handles, and please share that information. I certainly will be asking to try to see, because some of these presentations are going straight in my internal training manuals. And I expect that I'm going to be knocking down a few doors myself. Thank you so much, Sharon, for participating. Emanuela, always a ball of fire. Combat, I'll find you somewhere in Accra sometime. You owe me one of those. Herbert, hey man, I appreciate it. Jacqueline, thank you so much for coming on. And thank you for hopping in the chat. I saw that Boyega and a couple of people were setting off some firecrackers in there. And then last but definitely not the least, I'd like to thank everybody from the Jacobs Ladder Africa team. You guys always do such a phenomenal job getting us all together and getting us organized to be able to have some of these phenomenal conversations. So everybody at Jacobs Ladder, you can give yourself a pat on the back. I am not available to take any of you to that Brazilian steakhouse, but eventually when I make it out to Nairobi, I'm sure we'll do it. Sharon is paying. It'll offset some emissions, so Sharon is going to pay for that. Okay. Thank you everybody for participating in this session. Please, as we all need to share information, everybody needs to learn at every point. Thank you everyone for participating, and I'll hand over to Melanie for any cleanup items. But everyone have the most amazing week, and I look forward to seeing a lot more articles and documentaries coming out of this session going forward. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Engineer Jabesh. Just one last thing, I think you covered everything. It's just that I would appreciate it if people would fill in the feedback form. It's in the chat. It's been posted several times in the chat. We'd appreciate your feedback. And even as we plan to hold and host many more insightful webinars for you. So kindly, just go to the chat, please interact with the document there. Would really appreciate your feedback. And thank you so much for making the time and for staying on with us, even past time. So 10 minutes past time, actually. So we're grateful. Thank you. And we hope to see you at the next one.
All right. I appreciate it. Thank you all so much. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. Good night, everyone. All right.
Bye.
Yeah, good night. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Yeah.
Good night.
All right. Great. Thanks, guys. Thank you all so much.
Thank
Absolute
you.
pleasure.
Been wonderful.
Boyega, don't be getting in so much trouble. Metello, please don't be getting in any trouble.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.